and welcome back to my channel. Today's card features the Scrappy Tail Crafts Harvest Blessings card kit. This card kit comes with a 6x6 paper pad, the Harvest Wheat die, some gems. We also have the multi-layer sunflower stencil and die, and then the beautiful wild sunflower stamp set. I'll be focusing on the pattern paper and the wild sunflower stamp set. I wanted to show you how beautiful these sunflowers are, number one, and number two, I wanted to focus on keeping a card design simple and allowing your image to just really shine on your card. Here's a look at the card that we're creating. You can see the design is very simple, but yet it's very impactful. I stamped my image using antique linen distress ink onto some Fabriano Artistico watercolor paper. I'm going to be doing some watercoloring with my Corinne brush markers. I add the ink to my stamped image. I'm going one petal at a time, skipping between petals so that I don't get any contamination. That water, if it isn't dry, when you move on to the petal that is next to it, then that water, or that ink I mean, will flow into that area. So I began with the ink direct to the bottom of the petal, and then I used the water on my brush to move that ink, making sure that the ink was concentrated in the areas where the shadows would be, and then just pulling that ink out on this particular watercolor paper, which is a more expensive watercolor paper, but for me it's well worth the extra cost because it does move the ink beautifully in most cases. I'm going to show you an issue that I ended up having, but it was a bonus having this watercolor paper because it did not pill up like a less expensive watercolor paper would. As I mentioned, I did skip between my petals, so I'm not watercoloring petals that are next to each other. You want to make sure that everything is dry before you move on to the petals that are next to the ones you're working on. I'm adding a second layer of that ink because I do want something that's very vibrant. I will go between 2, 3, and you'll actually see 4 and 5 layers of ink on different areas of this panel. So here's where I had a little bit of an issue, and the paper was really helpful in helping me to work through this. Typically, I mentioned I will add my ink to a dry piece of watercolor or to the dry image, and then I'll move the ink using my brush and some water. But in this instance, you can see that that green ink on the left-hand side of that petal really did stick to the lines. So where I stamped my image, the ink went over top and I could not get it to move, just with that particular green color, and that was an olive green. Because I didn't like that dark line that I had, I went ahead and brought in a second color, which is called Curry, and I added it around the edges. So I created a shadow using the darker color. It helped cover up that area where the ink would not leave the antique linen, and then I'm leaving some white space or some lighter space, and that's where the highlight is going to be on my leaf. So I am going to work this particular leaf very heavy-handedly, which again is one of the bonuses of having this more expensive watercolor paper. If you don't do a lot of watercoloring, if you don't have a brush marker like this and you're using, you know, just inexpensive watercolors, you can probably get away with the Canson, but I find that with more expensive watercolors, they just tend to flow better on the cotton paper. And for me, just having a nice pad of that, making that initial investment and then working with my more expensive watercolors on those pads really, to me, is well worth it, because you're going to see just how beautiful and vibrant this particular image is. I went with the same olive color on the second leaf, but you can see that I learned my lesson and I didn't take the ink direct to paper. I went ahead and added it to my glass mat, and then I picked up the color using my watercolor brush that was slightly dampened. I do make sure, you can see that microfiber cloth over to the left. I do make sure that I'm wiping off any excess water so I don't get big pools of water, and you see how much easier this is blending together. So I'm not going to have to work as hard on this leaf. I thought that the light source was maybe coming a little bit more head on to this leaf, so I'm not going to color it quite as deeply as I colored the leaf that is now on the right. But I think that they complement each other. I did add a little bit of that curry to the stem of the flower. And I'm making sure that I dry everything. If I did not have dry sunflower leaves or sunflower petals, then that water would definitely start to seep into those areas. So you want to make sure as you move from area to area that it's dry, and you can use your heat tool to do that. I typically use my Ranger heat tool, but I happen to have the embossing gun on my desk, and I just went ahead and used that for this. So you can see I'm working those leaves pretty heavily, especially the one on the right. And then once I finish with this, I'm going to move on to the center of my flower. So the leaves are completely dry. I'm going to add a cocoa color. I'm going to add a lot of water to the center and drop my ink in, making the center of my sunflower. I don't know, I kind of felt like the center of a sunflower is much darker than the outer edges of the center, if that makes sense. So I was a little bit more heavy-handed on that center, and then I lightened it up, and I just drew that ink away so that the outer edges would be lighter. I wanted this sunflower, as I mentioned, to be the focal point of my card. I thought that if I went with a really vibrant color, instead of going with your traditional yellow, I went with an orange. I thought with going with something a little bit more vibrant and going with more subtle tones and a subtle design on the card itself, that it would really make this pop. And as you saw at the beginning of this video, I think that I was able to achieve that. Because I lost some of the definition of those veins in the leaves, I'm using my Faber-Castell Polychromo. It's a deeper green. I'm using that. It's a very sharp pencil, and I'm using that to add the details back into those leaves. And then I'm going to add a little bit of shading, just because that green is a different color than the watercolors. I want to make sure that it's a little bit more cohesive, and so I add a little bit of shading around the edges of those leaves to tie that back in. I'm going to add a second coat of the watercolor to the center of the flower. And I went with the brown because I didn't want that black I just felt like the black would be a little bit more stark, and that the brown would blend a little bit more with the pattern paper that I was using. I wanted to add the details to the center, so you tend to have texture in the center of a sunflower. I started off with a brown pencil, and then I ended up moving to my Micron pen. I thought I would use my gel pen, but my gel pen just wasn't working. I didn't use it all summer long, so I have to figure out a way to see if I can get that ink flowing again, or I'm going to have to buy a new one. But it wasn't working, and so I went ahead and used my Micron pen. The card kit does not come with the dies. I prefer the coordinating dies when they cut out sentiments. So I could have used my brother's Scan and Cut to cut out this sunflower, but it was more for this stamp set has tons of sentiments in it, and I wanted to make sure that I had those dies because my Scan and Cut doesn't cut them out perfectly, and I just think that it's a nice added detail to cards. So here again I went with an off-white. This is it's like a creamy color and has little specks of brown in it. I'm used a rectangle die that had a rounded edge, and then I think it's maybe, I would say it's approximately 3 3/4 long, maybe, or wide, and then it's about 4 3/4 long, something like that. Anyway, that doesn't matter. You can see that I do have a nice little border from that craft cardstock. I used my favorite Arches die. This die is one that I have, since the moment I got it, I've been using it on a lot of cards. I used a piece of the pattern paper to cut out that green polka dot arch, and then I used 2 pieces of the craft cardstock to create a frame to go around it, and I thought that this was a nice place to hold my sunflower. And again, very simple design. I've added some ribbon to the center of that cream cardstock, and I'm going to add a bow to this, but first I want to make sure that I get my sentiment on there. I'm using some eucalyptus ink from Catherine Pooler. I thought that it went very well with the ribbon. I'm into ribbon these days. I know if you've been watching my channel that you see lots of ribbons on my cards. I just think it adds a nice softness, and it's absolutely just beautiful and soft and pretty on these cards. I'm going to adhere this directly to my arch, and then I'm going to quickly realize that I don't like it flat against it. Because I used art glitter glue, that glue will dry clear. You're not going to see it. So I'm just lifted it off, added some 1/4 inch foam tape to the back of this, and you're going to see how much better it pops off of that little arch. I had to use wet glue to glue my bow, and you see I have my reverse tweezers there. My hot glue gun, I used it twice. It was a cordless one, and now it's not heating up at all, so I was forced to use that art glitter glue. It does take a little bit longer to dry, and you know, it's not my glue of choice. I definitely would have went with a hot glue for that, but I just didn't have a glue gun available to me. I stamped the sentiment, as I mentioned, that says "From our home to yours, happy Thanksgiving." I think this is a beautiful, it's so simple, it's so classic. Sabrina did such a beautiful job illustrating these sunflowers, and I think I'm going to create a few more, maybe in different colors, so blue sunflowers and some brown sunflowers, and I think that these are going to be nice cards to send out for the holidays. Looking at that craft cardstock, it was a little bit more plain than what I liked, so I did add one more piece of that very beautiful and vibrant pattern paper cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I'll adhere my panel to that, and that will complete my card for today. I'm going to add this one little button in place. It's a vintage brown button. I thought that it added a nice detail to the card. I'm going to show you the detail, show you how beautiful it is with the dimension. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I will have all of the products that I use linked in the description box below. If you have any questions, just let me know. Leave it in the comment box. And until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks for joining me.